In the upscale gated community of Willow Creek Estates, life was supposed to be peaceful and predictable. The neighborhood was filled with well-manicured lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. For Chris Martinez, this seemed like the perfect place to settle down while he focused on his demanding career. But Chris wasn't your average homeowner. He was a seasoned DEA agent with over a decade of experience in taking down some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Chris had recently purchased a house in Willow Creek, not just as a home, but also as a cover for his latest mission. He was working on an undercover operation, targeting one of the largest drug trafficking rings in the region. This wasn't just any case. It was a high-stakes sting that could dismantle a network responsible for flooding cities with illegal drugs. Every detail mattered, and every move had to be precise. Chris knew the risks, but also understood how critical this operation was. If successful, it could save countless lives. The night of the sting had finally arrived. Chris had spent weeks building trust with key members of the cartel, posing as a wealthy buyer interested in cutting a major deal. Everything was set up perfectly. His house, which he had turned into a temporary command center, was equipped with hidden cameras, microphones, and other tools to capture evidence. The suspects, a group of high-ranking cartel members, had taken the bait and agreed to meet him at his home under the pretense of discussing business. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Chris greeted the men with a calm demeanor, making sure they felt comfortable enough to drop their guard. Drinks were poured, and small talk filled the air, all part of Chris's plan to create a relaxed atmosphere. Slowly but surely, the conversation shifted toward the deal. Chris listened intently, nodding along as the cartel members outlined their proposal. It was going exactly as planned. Years of training and preparation were paying off, and Chris could feel the weight of justice tipping in his favor. But then, just as Chris thought he was about to secure the evidence needed to bring these criminals to justice, an unexpected sound shattered the quiet tension in the room. Loud banging erupted from the front door, echoing through the house like a thunderclap. Everyone froze. The cartel members exchanged wary glances, their hands instinctively moving toward the weapons tucked beneath their jackets. Chris's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Who would dare interrupt at this hour? Through the peephole, Chris saw two uniformed security guards from the Homeowners Association standing on his porch, their flashlights casting sharp beams of light onto the walls. One of them shouted, "Open up. We've received noise complaints." Chris clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling inside him. Noise complaints. At a time like this, these guards had no idea what they were walking into or how close they were to derailing months of painstaking work. Chris took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Not when so much was on the line. As the guards continued pounding on the door, demanding entry, Chris realized he had only seconds to think of a way to handle the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. The banging on the door grew louder, each knock reverberating through the house like a warning bell. Chris's mind raced as he tried to process the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, in the middle of one of the most critical operations of his career, and two overzealous HOA security guards were threatening to blow everything apart. The cartel members inside the room were already on edge, their hands hovering near their weapons. One wrong move, one misstep, and the entire operation could turn into a bloodbath. Chris knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let the guards barge in, not with the suspects sitting right there, armed and suspicious. Any hint that this was a sting operation would send them into panic mode, and Chris wouldn't just lose the case. Lives could be at risk. But how could he get rid of the guards without raising suspicion? With no time to waste, Chris signaled for calm, holding up a hand to reassure the cartel members. "Relax," he said smoothly, his voice steady and confident. "It's probably nothing. Just stay here. I'll handle it." His tone was authoritative, the kind that commanded respect. It wasn't just an act. It was years of training kicking in. He needed the suspects to believe he was still in control, even though his pulse was racing. Stepping toward the door, Chris positioned himself so that his body blocked the view of the living room. He didn't want the guards to see anything, or anyone, that might raise questions. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to peek out. Standing on the porch were two uniformed security guards, flashlights in hand, looking more annoyed than concerned. One of them, a burly man with a clipboard, scowled at Chris. "We've had reports of noise coming from your house," the guard said, his voice firm. "Some neighbors called it in. They say it sounds like a party, or something suspicious." He emphasized the last part, clearly trying to sound intimidating. Chris bit back a sarcastic remark. Suspicious. These guys had no idea what real suspicion looked like. "Look," Chris replied, keeping his tone casual but firm, "I'm in the middle of something important here. Whatever your neighbors heard, it's none of their business." He leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. "You really don't want to interrupt me right now." But the guards weren't backing down. The second one, younger and more eager, craned his neck, trying to peer past Chris into the dimly lit house. "We need to check it out," he insisted. "Rules are rules. If there's a disturbance—" "There's no disturbance," Chris interrupted sharply, stepping forward to block their view again. His heart was pounding, but he kept his expression neutral. Inside, he could hear faint murmurs from the cartel members, their voices growing tense. Time was running out. If the guards pushed any further, the cartel members would start asking questions, and Chris couldn't afford that. He glanced briefly over his shoulder, ensuring the suspects were still seated. Then, turning back to the guards, he adopted a tone that brooked no argument. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This isn't some neighborhood dispute. I'm handling private matters here, and trust me, you don't want to stick your noses where they don't belong. Now go. Back off." For a moment, the guards hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. They exchanged a glance, perhaps sensing that Chris wasn't someone to be trifled with. But before they could decide, movement caught Chris's eye inside the house. One of the cartel members stood up, his hand resting conspicuously on the bulge beneath his jacket. Chris's stomach dropped. This was bad. Very bad. Chris's mind raced as he saw the cartel member rise from his seat, his hand hovering dangerously close to the weapon hidden under his jacket. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air thick with tension. Every second counted now. If the guards didn't leave immediately, the situation could spiral out of control, and fast. Chris knew that the cartel members were already suspicious. Their eyes darted between him and the door, their expressions growing darker by the moment. He had to act quickly before things escalated. Turning back to the guards, Chris forced himself to stay calm, even though his heart was pounding like a drum. He stepped closer to the doorway, partly to block their view, and partly to make them feel uneasy. "I'm telling you," he said in a low, urgent voice, "this isn't what you think. You're making a big mistake coming here tonight." His words carried a weight that made the guards pause. For the first time, they seemed unsure of themselves, glancing at each other nervously. The younger guard, still holding his flashlight, tried to peer around Chris again. "We just need to," he started, but Chris cut him off sharply. "No, you don't need to do anything," he snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're interfering with something way above your pay grade. Do you understand me? Leave. Now." The older guard frowned, clearly irritated but also sensing that something wasn't right. "We can't just walk away if there's a problem," he muttered, though his confidence was wavering. Chris clenched his jaw, realizing he needed to take drastic action. There was no more time for games. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his DEA badge, flipping it open so the guards could see it clearly. "I'm a federal agent," Chris said, his voice firm and authoritative. "This is an active operation. Whatever you think you heard or saw, it's not your concern. Go back to your posts and don't say a word about this to anyone. understand. The guards froze, their eyes widening in shock as they processed what they were seeing. One of them stammered, "We didn't know." "You're damn right you didn't know," Chris shot back, his frustration boiling over. "Now get out of here before you cause even more trouble." Without waiting for a response, he slammed the door shut and locked it, turning back to face the tense scene inside. The cartel members were on their feet now, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. One of them, a wiry man with sharp features, stepped forward. "What was that about?" he demanded, his hand still resting near his weapon. "Who were those guys?" Chris raised his hand slightly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Just some nosy neighbors," he said, injecting a note of irritation into his voice. "They've been complaining about noise all week. I told them to back off, but they wouldn't listen." He let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head. "Can you believe it? People these days have nothing better to do than stick their noses where they don't belong." The cartel members exchanged glances, their suspicion easing slightly. The leader of the group, a heavy-set man with a cold stare, finally spoke up. "This better not be a setup," he growled. "If we find out you're lying to us." Chris held his gaze, unflinching. "Trust me," he said, his voice steady. "I've got too much riding on this deal to risk screwing it up. Those idiots outside are irrelevant. Let's focus on what really matters, shall we?" Slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. The cartel members returned to their seats, though their eyes still flickered toward the door occasionally. Chris took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. That had been far too close for comfort. He couldn't afford another interruption, not when the stakes were this high. As he resumed his seat, he reminded himself to stay focused. The operation wasn't over yet, and there was still plenty of work to do. But for now, disaster had been averted. With the immediate threat of the HOA guards neutralized, Chris turned his full attention back to the cartel members. The room was eerily quiet now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. The tension hadn't fully dissipated. It lingered like a storm cloud, but at least the situation wasn't escalating further. Still, Chris knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Every word, every gesture, had to be calculated. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, resting his elbows on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. "All right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's get back to business. We were discussing terms before we were rudely interrupted." He allowed a hint of irritation to creep into his tone, reinforcing the idea that the guard's intrusion was nothing more than an annoying distraction, a minor inconvenience rather than a legitimate concern. The cartel leader, a burly man with a thick beard and piercing eyes, studied Chris carefully. There was a flicker of doubt in his expression, but also curiosity. Chris could almost see the gears turning in his head. Was this buyer genuine, or was there something more going on here? For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the cartel members exchanged cautious glances. Finally, the leader broke it. "You sure those guys weren't cops?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. His question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. It was a test, Chris realized, an attempt to gauge whether he was hiding something. If Chris hesitated or stumbled over his response, it could raise suspicions all over again. Chris didn't miss a beat. He chuckled lightly, shaking his head as if the very idea was absurd. "Cops. In Willow Creek Estates. Come on," he said, injecting a note of disbelief into his tone. "This is the kind of neighborhood where people call security over a barking dog. Trust me, those clowns outside wouldn't know a real investigation if it hit them in the face." He paused, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Besides, do I look like someone who gets rattled by a couple of rent-a-cops?" The comment drew a few chuckles from the group, though they were short-lived. The leader didn't laugh, but his posture relaxed ever so slightly. Chris could tell he was buying it, or at least willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for now. That was good. Very good. But Chris knew better than to celebrate prematurely. One wrong move, and the fragile trust he built would shatter. The conversation shifted back to the deal, with the cartel members laying out their proposal in greater detail. They discussed quantities, pricing, and logistics, their voices low but animated. Chris listened intently, nodding along and asking pointed questions to make it seem like he was deeply invested in the negotiation. In reality, his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about how close they'd come to disaster. Those guards had nearly blown months of careful planning. What if they decided to report what they'd seen tonight? What if someone else showed up demanding answers? But Chris pushed those thoughts aside. Worrying about what-ifs wouldn't help him now. Instead, he focused on maintaining control of the situation. He made mental notes of everything the cartel members said, knowing that every detail would be crucial evidence later. At the same time, he kept an eye on their body language, watching for any signs of renewed suspicion. So far, they seemed convinced. As the meeting dragged on, Chris found himself growing more confident. He was back in his element, navigating the delicate dance of undercover work with precision and skill. By the time the cartel members finally stood to leave, satisfied with the progress they'd made, Chris felt a small sense of relief wash over him. The operation was still intact. For now. After seeing them out, Chris locked the door behind them and exhaled deeply. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. He pulled out his phone and dialed his supervisor. "We've got a problem," he said quietly, summarizing what had happened. "But we're okay, for now. Just keep an eye on those guards. I don't want them causing any more trouble." Hanging up, Chris sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. It had been a long night, one filled with risks and close calls. But as he sat there in the quiet aftermath, he reminded himself why he did this job. Justice wasn't always easy, but it was worth fighting for. And tonight, despite everything, he'd managed to stay one step ahead. By the time the sun rose over Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Word had spread quickly about the mysterious events at Chris Martinez's house the night before. Neighbors who had been woken by the commotion, or simply heard rumors, were eager to piece together what had happened. Some claimed they'd seen HOA security guards banging on Chris's door late at night. Others whispered about strange cars parked outside his house and shadowy figures moving inside. Speculation ran wild, ranging from noisy parties to something far more sinister. The HOA, meanwhile, found itself in an awkward position. The head of the security team called an emergency meeting early that morning to address the fallout. Both guards involved in the incident were present, looking sheepish and defensive as their supervisor grilled them for answers. "What exactly did you think you were doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. "You don't just barge into someone's home without verifying the situation first." The younger guard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We got a noise complaint," he mumbled. "We didn't know. We thought it might be trouble." "Trouble?" The supervisor shot back, throwing up his hands. "You nearly caused trouble. Do you have any idea who lives there? That man is a DEA agent. He was in the middle of some kind of operation." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Even the older guard, usually unflappable, looked pale. They hadn't known. How could they have? But ignorance wasn't going to shield them from the consequences. As news of the botched intervention trickled out, reactions among the residents varied. Some neighbors expressed sympathy for the guards, believing they were only doing their jobs. Others criticized the HOA for being too quick to meddle in people's lives. A few even joked about how the guards had unknowingly stumbled into something way above their heads. "Guess they should have checked Google before knocking," one neighbor quipped during a morning coffee chat. For Chris, the aftermath was a mix of relief and frustration. He spent the early hours debriefing with his team, ensuring that the cartel members hadn't tipped off anyone else in their network. Fortunately, surveillance showed no unusual activity around the neighborhood or signs of panic within the organization. it seemed the operation was still intact. For now. Still, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that this close call could have ended very differently. If those guards had pushed harder, if the cartel members had reacted more aggressively, things could have spiraled out of control. Later that day, Chris decided to take matters into his own hands. He requested a private meeting with the HOA board to explain the gravity of what had happened. Sitting across from them in a sterile conference room, he kept his tone measured but firm. "I understand you're trying to keep the neighborhood safe," he began, "but last night was a textbook example of why vigilance needs to come with common sense. You can't just show up unannounced and start pounding on doors without considering the bigger picture. What if my cover had been blown? What if someone had gotten hurt?" The HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Linda, nodded solemnly. "We never intended to cause harm," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "But clearly our protocols need improvement." She promised to implement stricter guidelines for handling similar situations in the future, including mandatory training for all security personnel. Chris appreciated the gesture, though he knew it wouldn't undo the risks they'd taken. As he left the meeting, Chris felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved that cooler heads had prevailed. On the other, he couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that suburban security guards would almost derail a federal sting operation? Shaking his head, he climbed into his car and drove home, already mentally preparing for the next steps in the investigation. Life in Willow Creek Estates was anything but boring, and Chris had a feeling that wouldn't change anytime soon. The days following the chaotic night at Chris Martinez's house were a whirlwind of activity for both the DEA and the residents of Willow Creek Estates. For Chris, the immediate priority was ensuring that the sting operation remained on track. Despite the unexpected interruption, the cartel members appeared to trust him. For now. Over the next few days, Chris stayed in close contact with them, exchanging messages and setting up additional meetings to finalize the deal. Each interaction was a delicate balancing act, requiring him to maintain his cover while gathering enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. Behind the scenes, the DEA team worked tirelessly to analyze the information collected during the initial meeting. Hidden cameras and microphones had captured critical details: faces, voices, conversations, and even partial license plate numbers from the vehicles parked outside Chris's house. Every piece of data was meticulously reviewed, cross-referenced, and cataloged. It wasn't long before investigators identified key players within the cartel network, tracing their connections to larger operations across state lines. The scope of the case grew bigger by the day, confirming just how high stakes this mission truly was. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek Estates, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an unusual incident. Neighbors continued to speculate about what had happened at Chris's house, though most were careful not to pry too much. After all, no one wanted to risk angering someone who carried a federal badge. Some residents began referring to Chris jokingly as the guy who scared the HOA straight, a nickname that made its way around the community. While Chris appreciated the humor, he kept a low profile, focusing on his work rather than indulging in small talk with curious neighbors. For the HOA, however, the fallout was far more serious. The security team faced intense scrutiny from both residents and leadership. Several meetings were held to discuss what had gone wrong and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Under pressure from homeowners and local authorities alike, the HOA announced sweeping changes to its policies. Guards would now undergo mandatory training sessions on recognizing signs of law enforcement activity and understanding when, and when not, to intervene. Additionally, new protocols required security personnel to verify potential disturbances with local police or other relevant agencies before taking action. Chris attended one of these training sessions at the HOA's request, offering insights into how federal agents operate in residential areas. Standing in front of a room full of guards, he spoke candidly about the importance of discretion and professionalism. "You're here to protect the neighborhood," he said, pacing back and forth as he addressed the group. But sometimes, doing your job means knowing when to step back. Not everything is what it seems. His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom looked genuinely remorseful for their role in the fiasco. One guard approached Chris afterward, extending a hand. "I just want to say, I'm sorry," he admitted, his voice sincere. "We didn't mean to cause trouble. We were just trying to do our jobs." Chris shook his hand firmly, nodding. "I get it," he replied. "But next time, think twice before knocking on someone's door at midnight." As the weeks passed, the sting operation reached its climax. Thanks to Chris's efforts and the support of his team, the DEA successfully arrested multiple high-ranking members of the cartel during a coordinated raid. The bust made headlines nationwide, hailed as a major victory in the fight against drug trafficking. In Willow Creek Estates, residents watched the news with a mix of pride and disbelief. Their quiet suburban neighborhood had unknowingly played host to one of the largest takedowns in recent history. For Chris, the success of the operation brought a sense of fulfillment, but also reflection. He knew that while justice had been served, the experience underscored the unpredictable nature of his line of work. Whether facing armed criminals or overzealous HOA guards, every day presented new challenges. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Chris couldn't help but smile. Life in Willow Creek might never be boring, but then again, that was exactly why he chose it. In the weeks that followed the successful takedown of the cartel, life in Willow Creek Estates began to settle into a new rhythm. The neighborhood had been through an unexpected roller coaster, and while things were quieter now, the incident left a lasting impression on everyone. For Chris Martinez, it was a reminder of how unpredictable his job could be, and how even the most mundane settings could become the stage for extraordinary events. The HOA took its lessons seriously, implementing not just policy changes, but also fostering a culture of mutual respect among residents and security personnel. Guards who once patrolled with clipboards and stern expressions now approached their duties with greater sensitivity and professionalism. Training sessions became regular occurrences, focusing not only on protocol, but also on understanding the diverse roles people might play within the community, whether they were stay-at-home parents, business owners, or undercover federal agents. Chris occasionally crossed paths with some of the guards during his evening walks, and while their interactions remained polite and distant, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. They knew better than to knock on his door again without a very good reason. And Chris, for his part, appreciated their efforts to improve. He even exchanged a few friendly nods with the younger guard who had apologized after the training session. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start. For the neighbors, the story of DEA agent versus HOA security became something of a legend, a tale told at dinner parties and holiday gatherings. Some joked about starting a petition to rename the street where Chris lived to Sting Lane, while others simply marveled at how close they'd come to witnessing something far more dangerous. Despite the humor, there was also a newfound appreciation for privacy and discretion. Neighbors learned to think twice before reporting every little noise, realizing that sometimes minding their own business was the best way to keep the peace. As for Chris, he found himself reflecting on the experience in ways he hadn't expected. On one hand, it reinforced his belief in adaptability and quick thinking, skills that were essential in his line of work. On the other hand, it reminded him of the importance of balance. While undercover operations often required secrecy and isolation, Chris realized he couldn't completely shut himself off from the world. After all, the support of his team, and even the quirky dynamics of his neighborhood, had played a role in helping him navigate the chaos. One Saturday afternoon, as he worked on planting flowers in his front yard, a nod to Sarah's gardening hobby from the previous story, he noticed a few neighbors stopping by to chat. At first, he thought they might ask prying questions about the case, but instead, they offered simple pleasantries and compliments about his landscaping skills. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, Chris felt like he was truly part of the community, not just blending in, but belonging. That evening, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, Chris let himself relax. The bust had been a major victory, but it was moments like these, the quiet ones, that reminded him why he did what he did. Protecting communities wasn't just about dismantling criminal networks. It was about creating spaces where people could feel safe, connected, and free to live their lives without fear. Willow Creek wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was home. And for Chris, that was enough. Still, as he gazed out at the neatly trimmed lawns and flickering porch lights, he couldn't help but chuckle softly. Who would have thought that a gated suburban neighborhood would teach him so much about trust, resilience, and the power of second chances? Life was funny that way, full of surprises you couldn't plan for. But then again, if Chris had wanted predictable, he wouldn't have chosen this line of work, or this neighborhood, in the first place.